cool.
I think this is about it. There's a few other people sort of floating around somewhere, but we'll kick off. So welcome to the July Bitcoin Melbourne meetup. This month we've got a very special guest all the way from Sydney. So really excited to hear about this. Before I jump into it, I'll start with this intro, right? Which is, from the moment I heard about Bitcoin, the really interesting part was always the underlying technology, which we all know is called the blockchain, and the use cases that sort of people have been talking about, and some of the more interesting use cases that will emerge over the next X years. And one of the more interesting use cases that I heard very early on when I started getting into Bitcoin was about the possibility of voting on the blockchain. Right? And to date, I really haven't seen anyone do it until I heard about Max and his project out in Sydney. So I'm really excited to introduce Max. So he's running a neutral voting bloc, a political party that's looking to move voting to the blockchain. And I'm sure he'll explain his plan in more detail. We'll hear about some of the interesting aspects of the project, but just the idea that this is possible is within itself a really interesting concept. So I'm going to throw over to Max. And thanks a lot, Max, again for coming down and having a chat.
Yes, thanks, Alex. So the neutral voting bloc, to start with, just very brief overview. You can think of it sort of like, as in ideally, this wouldn't involve any people at all. It would just be software that we elect into Senate seats, essentially. For various reasons we won't go into in this, it doesn't work so well with like lower house seats, but in terms of both state and federal in the upper house, it's got a lot of potential, as well as local government. So the idea is to have a party, and then we have a voting system underlying that party, and then the elected officials just do whatever that voting system says. That's the idea. So, as a bit of a prelude, the way that this came about for me was that I was incredibly happy with like Australian politics and global politics in general. I think they're starting to show real signs of strain, and while pre-information age representative democratic systems weren't so bad, now that I don't think they're holding up nearly as well. So the two things that I think are really holding us back is, firstly, the difficulty of removing bad policy. And this isn't like, we do remove some bad policy, which is why democracy hasn't failed so far. But we also introduce a lot of bad policy, and we don't have, the optimum political strategy, both for parties and elected officials, is not removing bad policy. And I think that's one of the things that's causing the slowdown, the strain. The small caveat there, trying something new sometimes is the optimum strategy, and so we still do see elements of the idea of good government coming back. And the other thing that I think is very important is that we don't have any specialization in politics. You have when a politician specializes, they specialize in being a politician, not in being an agricultural politician or an economic politician or whatever else. There are some exceptions, but on the whole, you see people skipping around ministries. It's not like they're educated about each thing in great detail. So I think that's another issue. So anyway, in my opinion, something needs to be done. Over some time, I came up with the neutral voting bloc, and this is what this is all about. So the purpose of the neutral voting bloc is primarily to help us move into a democracy 2.0 style situation. The neutral voting bloc has been designed to be incremental, and it's designed to have this big moonshot at the end of it. The secondary purpose, or rather more the primary purpose, is to produce good policy and remove bad policy. If that's not happening, then all the blockchain stuff, that doesn't matter. All the other stuff, it doesn't matter. If we can't actually do what we should be doing to actually run a society, then it's pointless. So if we can't do good policy and remove bad policy, then whatever. So how we do these two things is specialization in trade in politics. Particularly if anyone's done Economics 101, then you've probably heard specialization in trade as being one of the main methods of prosperity and societal development. I think this is very lacking in politics, and I don't see a reason that we shouldn't try and engage with that sort of issue. There's also reducing political friction within society, which broadly speaking is about lowering the barrier to entry, trying to get people involved, making it easy to do one thing once and still have a say without being overburdened by the political process. To protect and produce civil liberties, it's important to remember that civil liberties aren't like human rights. They're not something that we just have by existing. These are things that we build from the systems we use and within the systems we use. So I think it's very important to protect and produce those. And finally, to prevent corruption, which is actually way more of a side effect than anything else, and that just comes from transparency and debate. So, why the neutral voting bloc? There are a number of other parties that have similar Democracy 2.0 goals, and the neutral voting bloc has two particular things that stand out. No, I've listed 6. So the first thing is voting on the blockchain is efficient, immutable, and public. This is something that we lack from our current voting systems, and so I think that that's something that Democracy 2.0 should definitely try and pick up. As we'll see, we actually need the blockchain, and we can't do it without it for various reasons. The neutral voting bloc is also pure in the sense that it separates the institutional theory from its policy, and so like the neutral voting bloc could be used for Nazism if they wanted to. It doesn't have a say in policy. There are various reasons why it's very unlikely to end up being used for that, and they have to do with the way that debate and conjecture and so on happen within the party. It's also incremental in a very soft fork style. For those who have kept up with Bitcoin on the technical side, the idea of a soft fork is that you work within the existing protocol to introduce new features without having everyone needing to change the software. And so in the context of policy, this means we don't need to rewrite our constitution, we don't need to change our election system, we can work within the existing framework until we know that this has been a success, and then we can move over in a hard fork style. So it's easy, like it can fail safely, it's not a permanent change, it's very fluid, and it can come and go as it pleases. Liquid democracy is used for efficient voting. We'll look into that in the next section. Has anyone here heard of liquid democracy? We have 1, 2, 4? 4? Okay, cool. So I'll go through and I'll try and explain liquid democracy. It's if you've done any data structures sort of stuff, it's basically a tree structure or a graph and applying that to democracy, and we'll see how that works to be far superior to direct democracy in a moment. Finally, the neutral voting bloc engages in party-party interactions. So it's not a party that exists in isolation. It's not going out there and just trying to do one thing and get people on board. It can only exceed because of the party-party interactions. This is a property of the Australian electoral system, particularly single transferable vote that we use in the Senate and legislative councils in the states. Oh no, what's going on? Do you want to try and fix that, Pentels? Yep. And the final point on that slide was universality, which is a curious property that's mostly philosophical.
Present? Can we get
present and top right.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ben.
I know. Yeah. And the final one was universality, which means that, so the idea of a government or a system of governance that has universality will not be limited by the size of the country or the planet or even the solar system or anything else. It can expand infinitely, and it can deal with all the problems that come with that. Now, it doesn't, I think it's pretty obvious that our current system of governments does not have universality as a property. We have, terrible trouble with international trade, and I can't imagine the Australian political system becoming so popular that everyone else in the world adopts it. So, on the idea of a soft fork, I've gone over this mostly, but the idea is that the neutral voting bloc can be built within the existing political structure. It can be built as a single party or a coalition of party or many compatible parties. It has some nice additive properties. I don't go into that because it's a bit deep, but we can talk about that later if anyone's interested. And the idea is that once we get, say, 80% of Parliament using the neutral voting bloc, then we can strip away the existing infrastructure and just move to voting on the blockchain and having what I think is a better system. So there's a lot of philosophy that's sort of baked into the neutral voting bloc. It's very philosophically laden, but the bad news is that the philosophy that it uses is not widely respected yet, even in scientific communities where it has particular applicability. I think it's correct, but it's pretty deep. So it comes from modern epistemology, which is knowledge about knowledge. And basically, the idea is that we should abandon the who should rule question. This has been a topic that most democracies have dealt with. The idea of how do we elect people, who should be elected, it's like giving, almost as though we see elections as a way to justify our rulers, as opposed to abandoning the question altogether, which I think is more appropriate in the long term. So the two main focuses of the neutral voting bloc is the removal of bad policy and bad rulers. That is more important than anything else. And then as a secondary one, the creation of new options. Particularly, we don't need to necessarily create good policy every time. We just need to keep coming up with new options, and then we need to have a good selection process with which we select the best ones and remove the ones that have become outdated. I think that the neutral voting bloc can definitely help us along this way, though it doesn't get all the way there. And if anyone wants to know more, then The Beginning of Infinity by David Deutsch is the book to read. It's very good. I highly recommend it, though it is quite dense. So, the neutral voting bloc has this sort of thing going on where we can sort of say, like, if it's so good, if it's so amazing, if all this, is possible, then why isn't it happening yet? Why aren't people adopting it? All this sort of other thing. And, I mean, besides it being incredibly new, the way that I looked at this is basically if we have something that's amazing, then how can we really say it's amazing if we can't outcompete what we already have? There has to be some way that we can use this in some sort of interaction to become better than the existing system. And so this is one of the things that the neutral voting bloc aims to do, is to consume our legislative bodies by outcompeting the existing system and by providing more both to other parties and to people. So, as we can see, so the way it works with parties is it offers greater but very specific power to other parties. This basically means that the parties who want to, like the Animal Rights Party, gets to do all the animal rights stuff, but they don't touch any economic policy. You've got someone who's very passionate about education, they handle that. So this is where specialization and trade start coming in, and those sort of things start emerging. And then also for citizens, it provides a method of participation and input that we don't have in our current systems. Currently, we elect someone every 3 years, and then we shut up, and then we do the whole process again. The neutral voting bloc wants to have people being able to input their new ideas all the time and compete with existing ideas. So, there's another property here, which is that because there is specialization and trade going on within the neutral voting bloc, there is therefore competition between actors within the neutral voting bloc. If you're trading, then you need to convince people to give you their vote on particular issues, and presumably you give something back. But if there are two people or two actors who are competing for that or wanting that, then obviously we end up with a system of competition similar to economics. And that's by design, well, sort of. In a sense, it's intended, but it's an emergent property of liquid democracy. So the idea of other parties competing with each other is also crucial to establishing a very efficient state. So why did I start the neutral voting bloc? There are a few points here. The first is it's got to be a better way. The idea that our current systems are pretty crap, and that we need to be able to figure out a way that doesn't involve violence. It doesn't involve, if everyone does it my way, to be so much better. A way that's actually incremental, that can go forward and really pick up momentum. So it's permissionless for the most part. We do need 550 members to start a party, or 100 signatures to run as an independent at the federal level. But for the most part, that's pretty easy to do in a country of 20 million people. So mostly permissionless. It's innovative for reasons we'll see. It's got huge potential, again, because it can consume the whole parliament. It's fallible, which here means that if it is a bad idea, it won't work. Once we get to the stage of actually getting someone in power, then it'll fall apart and we'll know that it was a terrible idea. But if it gets there, then it allows it to be tested, and if it succeeds, then we know it's passed the test of fallibility, which is, so to contextualize that, fallibilism is basically the underlying principle that allows science to work and continue to improve and create knowledge. So that's baked in as well. And then universality, again, the idea of having infinite reach, being able to be applied to essentially an infinite...
Do you have the same questions now?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, just on the permissionless.
Yeah.
Can you just elaborate on that for me? Because in my mind, if you've got continual feedback, direct feedback, that's probably more permission-based than permissionless. Help me understand
what I mean by permissionless in this case is that if we can get 100 people together, and we can get a senator on the ballot, and that senator can say, anyone who preferences me, any of the parties who preference me, will get a say in how I vote in the actual Senate, and that person then gets elected, we don't need any permission to introduce this new game theory, this new way of interacting with other parties. The system is structured enough so that we can break the rules. We're not really breaking any rules, but we can act in this unorthodox manner without permission. So it's not so much about the actual getting there. It's once we're there, we don't need to change any rules, but we can act in this way that really shakes things up. Does that sort of answer the question?
So in other words, the preferences are pre-arranged, and therefore there's no need to dispute it post-election. Is that what you're saying?
No, so sort of what I mean by this is really that we don't require constitutional reform to introduce this new system of voting. Is that we don't need a big legal process, we don't need to prove it first, we can just go and try it. If it works, it works, if it doesn't, it doesn't.
Okay.
We can just create it and go. So more in line with sort of like the way that Bitcoin is permissionless in that sense. No worries. So then what does it do? So in the short term, we can see it gives citizens a new way to influence Senate votes. That's in the open participation sort of category. It also gives minor parties a safe model for a coalition. We'll see that's basically because the blockchain is trustless, and we'll look at that more later on. In the long term, outcompete other parties in the parliament in terms of democratic services provided to people, which really is the production of good policy and the rule of bad, and then also the jump to universality. To give an example of the universality, I don't talk about it after this slide, I don't think I mentioned it at all. But the idea of the neutral voting bloc being, or having universality, is that if the entire Australian Parliament was operating under the neutral voting bloc, 100% of the Parliament, and also 100% of New Zealand's Parliament was neutral voting bloc, there is no difference besides semantic difference between one and two countries in that case. They will work together as freely as they work apart. They can be structured or unstructured together, it doesn't really matter. They can merge their voting systems, they can decide international things in the same way under the same banner without sacrificing their own sovereignty. And so that's part of the idea about universality, is that if this then spread to every country on earth, then it wouldn't really be one world government, and it wouldn't be that everyone's lost their government, but we just have universal governance. And so that's sort of like, I think, an important property of Democracy 2.0 is to actually be compatible with future upgrades. And it seems like the best way to deal with it is to just go there straight away. So there are some actual structural changes that are required in terms of legal structural changes, particularly that any subgroup that is being legislated on from the masses needs to be able to veto that little legislation. So you need a majority both in the external and internal communities, and that mirrors international politics somewhat if you think about it. But that's the main change.
Can you program that in the program?
Yes, but that's a bit more difficult because geography doesn't really overlap nicely with code. We can do that.
But when everybody registers, I suppose they can say where they are. Like, they could be attached to their name or something.
When they register, they'll be registering with a central authority that will designate the jurisdictions they're under. For example, if we have this at a local level, then people need to be allocated to the local electorates and so on. So that's part of it essentially. But the idea is that we can do it under one banner, we can do it under the one software, the one interpretation. Okay, so why would people actually vote for the neutral voting bloc at all? This is important. So democracy is stale, they want something better. To increase debate and conjecture, this is basically done by getting more actors into having a position of say, and being open, getting everyone involved, everyone able to contribute. It increases the quality of legislation, both by having strong veto power with the balance of power in the Senate, and also being able to remove bad legislation. It's trying something new that we haven't done before. Obviously, if we have troubles, then we've got to try something that no one's done before, if no one else has thought of a solution. It prevents/socializes corruption, and what I mean by that is that say we had a mine that wanted to like a coal mine wanted to be dug up next to a town. Traditionally, they would go to the state government would give them a license, maybe there's some stuff going on there. In this case, then because of the idea of the town having veto power, the mine has to buy out the town. So if the mine came along and said, we'll give $20,000 to everyone as long as you let us put a mine in there, then we end up socializing the corruption, which really is just the company paying for the rights to, abuse the town and, pollute the air and that sort of thing. So that, anyway, we'll go past that. And then policy-based politics as well sort of comes out of the specialization in trade, which is the property of liquid democracy. And that's something that people, as in policy-based politics, I think people are pretty strongly behind, or at least the minor party crew. So, liquid democracy and other types of democracy. What we'll start doing is we'll start by looking through representative democracy, direct democracy, and then I'll introduce liquid democracy and we'll try and build it up in terms of the others, or at least with some representation of the others. So, this is our field of people. All the black dots are people. And the two boxes at the bottom are just yes and no, or binary options, essentially. So, in a representative democracy, we can see that everyone votes directly. They vote directly for what they want, and we have two candidates listed there. And at the end, green candidate wins, hurrah. In a direct democracy, where we actually vote on each policy, We essentially have the same system except without the candidates. And obviously doing this requires 27 vote actions every time, which is inefficient in my opinion. So, these are the rules of liquid democracy for the neutral voting bloc. I presume, was that clear to everyone, like the direct democracy and representative democracy? Okay, cool. So I'll use those diagrams in a moment. So, liquid democracy. If anyone wants, they can vote directly. So, in the worst case, we go back to direct democracy. But everyone can also set a delegate or follow someone else. In the case that they do, and likewise, everyone can be made a delegate. That's not something you need permission for. In the case that someone is made a delegate, or you delegate to someone else and you don't vote, then it's like instructing your vote to just, whenever I don't vote, do whatever this guy does. And so in the case of, say we have, or actually we'll see the case in a moment. The idea is, though, that we construct these efficient hierarchical structures that channel votes through to actors, through to a small number of actors, so that not everyone needs to vote all the time, but they're still represented accurately. And then all actions take place immediately. That's important for like changing delegates and having reactivity and being able to respond quickly in society. So we're back to our group of all these people, and the first step is that in this system is everyone makes their delegation. So these dotted arrows show the delegation. The sizes are then relative to the amount of votes that each one has, just for convenience. So in a sample vote, every dot, so we can see here this has got 4 dots and then 5, because it includes that one. In this case, we've got the same structure we had before, and we have the same outcome, except that only 2 people have to vote. And so we can still have a representative ballot without having the burden of everyone having to vote. I'll go through, the next few slides are about various operations that each person can do.
Ask a quick question?
Yeah.
I'm taking it those configurations would be fairly dynamic.
Absolutely.
Probably change issue by issue, maybe.
So at the moment it's just one delegate for everyone, but there are options to delegate based on categories or with a routing system or other sorts of things.
So you could have defaults, and you could also write it real-time manually if you wanted to.
Absolutely. In the future we might see things like for economic issues, Bob Brown over here, or for other issues, Debbie or whatever else. But there are a lot like extensions to the protocol that aren't necessary for the core requirements. So,
just one
yeah.
more.
Oh yeah, go.
So how does the preference fit in here? So it looks to me like it's binary, yes or no, you voting for.
These are votes on issues, not for candidates.
Right.
And so for each issue, there's about legislation presented to the Parliament, and it's just a yes or no. Do we pass this? Do we not? And so this is represented here as binary. We can go with, so for example, you could even, under interesting circumstances, you could argue that group voting tickets in the Senate, in the federal Senate that we use now, are sort of similar to liquid democracy in the sense that when you vote above the line, we'll get into this in a minute as well, when you vote above the line, you basically say do whatever this guy does. Except in that case, you preference parties, and so there's a very limited number of options. But yeah, so this is on issues, not based on elections.
So does that mean every single issue, each individual has to choose whether they're choosing a delegate or voting directly, or?
Everyone has the option of voting directly or changing their delegate or other things. But the idea is that you set a delegate once and they deal with everything.
I see,
Yeah. And so most of the time, only 15 and 12 would actually vote on everything. And then any time that we'll go through the scenarios now. So let's say that this guy on the far right down here, he decides that he doesn't like the way that 12 was voting in a particular issue. On whatever ballot came through, he doesn't like it. So he goes on a one-off vote. And so he says, I'm just going to vote. Now his delegation stays in place. However, because he voted, his vote isn't transferred to the delegate and so not counted under the delegate's vote. So in this case, we have 3 vote actions. Doesn't change the outcome of the election, but this guy on the far right is satisfied at least. We then have a second, I call this a local one-off because it's sort of like a second level vote. Let's say that 4 sees that the legislation that 15 is voting on is not in their interest, but most of the other stuff is. So they leave their delegation in place, but on this one issue, they change their vote. And so even though only one person has made an extra voting action here, we can see that this swings the tide of the election. And so very, very reactive system, very optional, very easy for all this sort of stuff to go on. And then finally, we have a reorganization where 4 says, what used to be 15 doesn't represent my interests anymore. 15 becomes 11, and 12 becomes 16. And this is then a permanent change in the liquid democracy graph that governs how votes are distributed. Does everyone feel like they sort of get the idea of liquid democracy now?
Can you relate it back to the typical structure? So it's like along a party line versus an individual vote. Is that the way you compare it?
Sort of. This can definitely represent a party hierarchy, but it doesn't need to. Ideally, this would be represented. People would delegate those who are close in both geography and interests. So you delegate to a community leader or something like that. And obviously the leader you chose would probably fall in party lines somewhere for the most part.
So in this case, you're talking about a diagram that represents it, but given it's liquid governance or liquid democracy, it's only a state at any point in time. Right?
Absolutely.
It's continually flowing and changing and fluid.
The reactivity, I think, is crucial to being able to remove bad rulers or bad, people where society invests power in them. If they're bad, we need to be able to remove them quickly, and so that reactivity is very core.
So you're empowering the market dynamics,
yes,
as opposed to the inefficiency of the structure that exists. At the time, as an example, 3 years before you can actually change party or reorganise.
Yes, yeah. We can do things far faster than election, right. Definitely.
So, Max, is it the case that currently the way we sit, say, at a federal level, is just 11-16, right? Like if taking away dynamic, liquid aspect to this, the way it sits is the difference is that we have 11-16 on a continuous basis versus this dynamic structure by having different layers in place, right?
Yeah.
So, sorry.
Who introduces the legislation for the yes and no vote?
So that's not, the neutral voting bloc isn't concerned with that. This is basically whatever comes before the legislature in which the neutral voting bloc partaking. So it could be local council, or it could be federal, or whatever else.
When it takes over?
That's a future problem. There are a whole bunch of problems that don't really come up for another 20 years. Yeah. And I basically take it as granted that we'll come up with solutions to those in the meantime. I mean, there are plenty of ways that, off the top of my head, people could, propose things on the blockchain, and then if it reaches a critical mass of 5%, behind it, then it gets put forward as a massive vote or whatever else. There are plenty of ways to do that, but I don't think that we're not at that stage yet.
So I can speculate that communities could get together and form their delegates, and these delegates could specialise on different issues of interest to the community.
Absolutely.
They could report back, and they could also vote on it in a generally agreed way as issues come up on behalf of that community. Yep. So is there a reward system built in whereby delegates could actually be paid by their communities?
I would love that to be the case, but unfortunately current laws don't provide the freedom we need to be able to do that sort of flow of value. Now, when in the limit where we actually, if this becomes like a national thing, then definitely. But at this stage, and it would probably be just simply the number of delegates you have is then, that's somewhat open to manipulation, but on the whole, it's probably something similar to that, where basically the bigger your node, the more money you get.
You get a situation where someone's following someone that becomes almost like a loop where no vote actually...
Yeah, so if a cycle of polls, all votes involved count as abstentions. So when you sign up, the state that you're in to begin with is that of being looped back to yourself. You are your own delegate. And so cycles are the way that we tell that people want to abstain and basically not voting. But cycles are also a powerful feature because they allow for parties to essentially put each other in a round robin and handle individual issues in some sort of weighted manner. And so as we'll see in a moment, where are we? Okay, so if we can move beyond here, this is what would the neutral voting bloc look like. And I have here a cycle of 3. And so this might be the case that we have like animal rights, education, and economic policy. And this is the way the weighting's worked out. We'll end up with many, many more parties. This is meant to just show how dynamic it can be. Got a cycle of 2 over there. It's like, oh, there we go. So cycles are definitely a part of this. In terms of the end goal, the amount of votes that each party would have this is through the party-party interaction, would basically be a measure of how many preferences they gave to the neutral voting bloc. and that would be weighted based on the number of the preference. And we'll get into that later on as well. But that's sort of like meant to be more of a realistic look at what this might actually look like in real life. So are we all fairly comfortable with liquid democracy? I mean, obviously, it takes a little while to all this stuff to sink in, but there's some pretty good, or there's one good video on YouTube if you want to Google it later. But the idea is that it's a very reactive. The idea is that it's a very reactive system. So I've got a comparison here of representative, direct, and liquid democracies. The difficulty of rearrangement is that rearranging the power structure, taking someone out of power, putting them in, that sort of thing. With both direct democracy and representative democracy, you need to leverage the entire society, and so that's a difficult thing to do. Whereas with liquid democracy, as we've seen, one person changing them, one like medium level delegate, can then remove half the power that a higher level delegate has, and so very easy to rearrange. The difficulty of voting on bills is very easy in representative democracy because we put 150 people in a room, they put their hands up and we're done. With direct democracy, it's essentially leveraging everyone again, which is expensive, it's time consuming. But with liquid democracy, we have a very efficient system where very few voters are needed and so on. The difficulty of election or ballot essentially mirrors the above. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. And then here's so corruption down the bottom is usually the reason that people are like, yes, direct democracy. Accountability and, community saying okay to things. And I think that's the only advantage that direct democracy actually has over, or not even over liquid democracy, in common with liquid democracy. But we can see that, obviously I've, chosen this list particularly to make liquid democracy look good, but on the whole, I think that this really shows the power of this sort of rearranging structure.
It's interesting that you range those metrics there, but there's nothing that represents cost. The cost of these as well. Yeah, well, I mean, that's so...
I don't really consider cost because I'm working on an order of magnitude basis. We know that an election in a representative democracy costs in the tens of millions of dollars to carry out, sort of thing. Direct democracies would be likewise just as expensive unless we went with an electronic system. But even then, I want to also include the difficulty of when I say difficulty, I want to include the human labor costs involved and the difficulty of getting everyone to go out and vote or getting everyone to log in and vote. And with liquid democracy, you only need a few motivated people to do that, and you get the benefits of direct democracy. And so this is not just about money, but also about participation and time and all the rest of it that goes into it. And so that's why I went with such a simple metric as opposed to dollar values. Are we all good with... Yep?
Just one more question. So does this sort of fit in more also with the sort of community campaigning? Sort of the modern...
Yeah. It is very much in line with that. I think that if more... So, there's the Direct Democratic Party / Senator online in Australia. There's, maybe it's the DDP in the US. There's the Net Party in Argentina / South America. So there are a whole lot of these sort of grassroots, let's fix democracy with accountability style things going on. I just think mine's better. So, But yeah, liquid democracy I think is the key. Liquid democracy was recently popularized by the Pirate Party, by the way, in the way that they decided to structure their internal decisions on policy and so on. All good? So, Senate elections. This is the drier, boring part. I've cut a bunch of it out. Anyone here not Australian, hasn't voted in the Senate elections before? Got a few? Okay. Cool. So, I leave out some of the details, but to suffice it to say, we have a preferential system where the idea is that you enumerate all the candidates in the order of your preference. Some of the systems don't make you enumerate everyone, but this is the basic algorithm. So the idea is you enumerate your candidates, the votes follow the preferential order, and then we start by counting all the votes, figuring out which party has, is over a quota. If they're over that quota, they get elected, and then their votes get scaled back. This continues until no one's over the quota again. So if we have a candidate over the votes, then elect. Otherwise, eliminate the least popular candidate and pass the scaled votes on to the next preference. Now, usually, I'm just going to run back here really quickly to show you an animation that's quite fun. I think it's fun. This is an animation by a guy at Uni of New South Wales that shows this is the Victorian election in 2013. So we can see the first 4 seats there were just elected at the start. I'll just refresh it so you can watch that again. So this is quickly getting the first 4 seats. We can see the ALP and the Lib Nats get the bulk of those. And then we start because no one's over that quota, we start the elimination process. See Bank Reform Party, Socialist Equality, etc., etc. And as this gets bigger and bigger, we'll see the yellow bars get built up that indicate preferences. When there are multiple votes, it usually indicates different parties' preferences being allocated in a more complex fashion. So, we can see as this goes on, if you watch on the left, the Australian Motoring Enthusiast Party is the one that actually won the 5th seat, or 6th, whichever one it was. And we're getting close now. And you can see how much preferences matter at the end of the election. So, there we go. So they win out over the Libnats purely over preferences. If you'd like, this is, if you Google, I think it's ABC Senate infographics or something or other, then it comes up. Anyway, the takeaway from that, though, is that preference order really matters. This is the way that the neutral voting bloc gets an edge over other parties is by giving something back for other people's preferences. So, group voting tickets. This is the thing that everyone complains about with the elections. This is why we get random little minor parties involved, into the Senate. This is where all that yellow bar comes from. And the idea of the group voting tickets is that most people don't want to actually go through the process of enumerating every candidate. When there's 150 to enumerate, it's easy to screw up, it's a pain in the ass, and it's a really long sheet of paper. So they just put a 1 above the line, and they choose a predetermined enumeration which is set by the party. This is important. The reason that it's set by the party is to make it simpler, but it also gives the party a negotiating tactic between other parties. So that this preference order on the group voting tickets are therefore tradable commodities that can be used to improve one's chance of being elected. If any of you, for those who do or don't stay up with Australian politics, there's a guy called Glenn Drury who is responsible for organising minor parties most of the time to organise themselves in such a way to maximise their chance of getting elected. And it's this trading of commodities the commodity of the preference that is really the underlying economic interaction going on between the parties. And this is where the neutral voting bloc tries to get a leg up. So, when parties are preferencing each other, they make an economic consideration. And I've put the neutral voting bloc here twice on this one scale. Now, politics is of the nature such that you don't have many friends, and most of the relationships that are involved in preference trading are relationships of convenience, not of similar policies. And so, you'll have, random centrist parties, making preference deals with very right-wing parties or whatever else, because that's how they can organise themselves in such a way to guarantee that a minor party gets elected instead of all the preferences going back to one of the major parties. The neutral voting bloc is trying to set itself up. So I guess first off, this idea of trade, right? Imagine that instead of the neutral voting bloc using liquid democracy, that we use direct democracy. This takes away the ability of parties to preference each other and to allocate their preferences according to whatever structure they choose. By choosing direct democracy, you make everyone do everything all the time, and even if we were just doing this over 100 parties or so, you get to the point where you can't make decisions based on this, you can't trade that commodity. Whereas with liquid democracy, you can, by delegating each other, especially with categories, that helps. That's based on the number of votes you have, the alliance that you're going to make with other parties, different similarities of policy, all that sort of stuff. So, the idea is that the neutral voting bloc with trade is more useful than the neutral voting bloc without trade. And then by maximising that trade aspect, that specialisation aspect, you can maximise the number of preferences you get and have higher preferences, or lower, depending on, 1 is really what I'm going for there, as opposed to the more valuable preferences. So, trading legislative power makes the neutral voting bloc more attractive, and that every party must be placed somewhere on this line. Now, this is crucial. Because every party needs to be preferenced, there has to be an economic consideration. There has to be a comparison of different parties and a weighing up of how much is this party going to give me, what's the odds of getting elected if I preference these guys, and so on and so forth. There are very complex decision-making processes going on throughout this procedure, throughout the 3 or 4 months leading up to the election before group voting tickets have to be put in. So, the comparisons that parties actually need to make, these are some of the factors that they need to make and weigh up when they're considering different parties. So there's a chance of them winning a seat or their friends winning a seat. And also, this is interesting because minor parties will probably work with their friends preferentially before the neutral voting bloc because they're more similar. That is going to give them the best outcome if they happen to win. However, if everyone else outside their immediate circle of friends is preferencing the neutral voting bloc before them, then they have a bigger incentive to preference the neutral voting bloc because that maximizes their possible output. And so that's what, I mean, obviously you're working with rational actors and so on, and not everyone in politics is a rational actor, but for the most part, I think these sorts of things will play out. There's the value of participating, which ultimately is just the legislation you can put through. There's the so this is an interesting one here. Pooling across states. So imagine that you are the Family First Party for a moment. Imagine that you are, and you get maybe 20% of a quota in every state. Now, some elections you get lucky and your preferences pay off and you end up getting elected. But most of the time, you'll lose that 20% of the quota. If you preference the neutral voting bloc, then you're going to get, like out of the 6 states, you'll get 1.2 quotas at the end of it. And so you'll actually have more than a seat. And so by allowing parties to come together in a trustless fashion, we can actually help these minor parties maximize and get accountability, or, essentially get their I was going to say just desserts, but basically get the preferences that were allocated, like the first preferences, from actual Australians. And so pooling across states, I think, is a very important thing. The trading votes, as we've talked about. There's the chance of a non-favourable party winning a seat, as in the neutral voting bloc being neutral and not caring about policy is probably preferable to the polar opposite of you winning a seat. And so you're both more likely to preference the neutral voting bloc before preferencing each other, which I think is, like, at least with polar opposites, pretty straightforward. And then, again, it's a safety net against the LNP or ALP gaining a seat. There are 2 major parties, essentially. All minor parties would prefer another minor party getting a seat instead of a major party, and that's, that plays out in the preference order as well. That definitely helps the neutral voting bloc now that we're a bit more sophisticated and we actually, minor parties organise themselves. The neutral voting bloc is a nice safety net. And finally, there are strength in numbers. If the neutral voting bloc is a thing, then it's probably better to play along. So, this is I guess this is where the game theory comes in. So what I'm showing here is this, on the y-axis here, we basically have the reward for a preference. And on the x-axis here, we have the preference number. Now, these will go all the way up to 150, but we don't really care about anything past 60 or so. That just becomes totally worthless. 60 is also very, 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 low in value, but that plays out in the last 2, figuring out the last of 2 people to get elected to a seat. So the idea is that the higher your commitment, when you preference the neutral voting bloc very highly, then you should be rewarded by having a high conversion ratio for your preferences. So if someone puts through 300,000 preferences to the neutral voting bloc, it makes a difference whether they preference the neutral voting bloc 4th or 10th. And so that's what this curve is meant to do, is it's meant to optimize the incentives to try and get everyone to preference the neutral voting bloc above 10. I don't have the simulation graph in here, but I've done, probably about 50 simulations or so with different categories, with envelopes with different levels of participation, etc. And this is, in my educated guess at the moment, probably the type of curve that we want to offer other parties. And this is basically the incentive curve. So preferences are turned into voting rights. The higher the preference, the greater the representation. You can think of this as well as sort of like level of commitment. As the more you want to commit to the idea, the more you get out of it. Once it becomes a proven idea, hopefully we'll see everyone just preference this really highly, and then that's when we can start worrying about getting mass adoption and going forward.
Sorry, just back on that. So essentially that operates much like a web marketing mechanism where you actually send people to promote your post, promote your event, whatever it might be.
Essentially, yeah. It's not exactly the same, but for the most part, it's a designed incentive structure. And so, this isn't, an exact curve, obviously. This is just something I drew up. There probably is, a good explanation out there that'll give us a really nice curve. But for the moment, this is sort of it. So, but yeah, very similar to a referral type thing, or the more you want to contribute, the more you get out of it. That sort of deal.
Okay, and giving votes away is already part of the legislative structure in place, so there's no need to change to support this.
Yeah. Yeah, the trading is already all there in the group voting tickets itself, or single transferable vote in general. So, there's a good question that's why would micro-parties want to preference the neutral voting bloc? I've gone over some of these already. The first is that it gets more done. So because through specialization, they can further their agenda by becoming the dominant micro-party for that purpose. And so they give up their rights on everything else, and they just deal with their thing. That allows them to get more out of this. Potentially even up to like 6 seats worth of support, which is a massive amount, but they have to give up their rights to everything else. And that's the trade-off. It's not like a traditional Senate seat where you get in, even though you, like the Motoring Enthusiast Party, they don't care about pretty much everything. They only care about motoring and stuff. Under the neutral voting bloc, they would basically have the sole responsibility when voting on things about the automobile industry or whatever else. And they give up their right to vote on environmental stuff, unless, of course, it had something to do with automobiles, or economic things, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so through specialization and trade, they can get more done. It allows, this is basically the same point. It allows minor parties to trade votes so they can each do one thing well as opposed to doing everything badly. It's better than the other side / majority parties getting the last seat. Again, basically it's meant to be the neutral middle ground that allows people to come together before you have to give away your resources to the other side. Which currently is a reality of group voting tickets, is at some point, if your candidate isn't elected, you will help a candidate you don't want getting elected. And so hopefully the neutral voting bloc can be somewhere in the middle there. It allows pool preferences across state to increase overall exposure. That's pretty, covered that. And then if everyone else is doing it, you don't want to miss out. So if there's enough support already to basically guarantee the neutral voting bloc having a seat, then by not preferencing them highly, you're just giving away your preferences and they're going to get wasted. And you're not going to get anything out of it. And so this is where the incentive structure comes back in again, is to try and encourage people to preference the neutral voting bloc highly, though that does in some cases depend on a pre-existing candidate being in a legislative body. So the one big problem with all this is trust, which of course brings us to Bitcoin and the blockchain. And then I decided to call this protocol block voting, but that's a recent decision, so we'll see. Obviously, when you've got a whole lot of parties that don't agree with each other, like, Fred and I and the Greens coming together in one room, they're not going to trust each other. And they're not going to trust administration either. That's why the blockchain is there, because it is trustless and immutable. Because immutability is the strongest consideration, because really what we're doing in the blockchain is trying to develop one history that everyone can rely on and not have to, that we can take for granted, essentially. That means that immutability is most important, and because immutability is most important, the strongest chain is the one we'll choose. So currently that's Bitcoin, but if Litecoin took off tomorrow and ended up with costing more resources to take over, then that would be the more logical choice. So immutability enables trustlessness. I think that's fairly straightforward. The blockchain is basically used as a notice board. There's no. So in Bitcoin itself, if a transaction exists in the blockchain, then it is valid. If a vote exists in the blockchain under this protocol, that doesn't guarantee validity at all. That means that we can't have light clients in the same way that we can have Bitcoin light clients. That's unfortunate, but we can get around it in a number of ways. So existence does not equal validity, basically used as a notice board. And I guess importantly as well, the neutral voting bloc is not government on the blockchain. This is not a panacea for trying to, sweep away our existing political systems. This is just the incremental step that we can go and to provide the trustless voting system that we need to be able to support future upgrades. So, just a trustless voting system to enable competition, specialization, and trade, as we covered earlier. So this is the more technical slide. For those who are familiar with modern Bitcoin protocol stuff, we use the op return standard, which basically not zips, but concatenates everything up into a 40-byte string. This is just posted onto the blockchain in a standard transaction. Some of the example instructions that you can put in one of these are to cast a vote, or for the admin to modify a resolution /issue. You can empower a voter, which is how voting rights are actually distributed, and you can transfer identities. There are more complex operations that we'll come to in a moment. Because of the model that we've chosen, because because we don't have the existence equals validity, it makes it very, very easy to extend the protocol, especially in these early stages, and very, very easy to expand in a sort of soft fork manner. And when I say that, I mean in the actual Bitcoin technical sense this time. The design process is ongoing, and more features are being implemented. About 2 weeks ago, I implemented the transfer identity thing, for example. So very, very simple to get these sorts of features built. Now, this transaction here is a real transaction that exists on the blockchain, and if you want to go find these slides later, then you can click on this link and it'll take you there. And I've annotated here the transaction itself. So we can see that the input and the output go to the same address. This is the address that owns the identity of the vote in this case. Now, here we can see with the actual byte string itself, we've got a prefix to start, which is NVB to identify this as one of our transactions. We have the opcast, which is in hexadecimal 10. There's various ones in terms of like there's admin, there's transfer, there's cast, there's all that sort of stuff, and they're basically just one byte. Everything after that is then the arguments for that operation. In this case, the vote scalar, which is just I guess the way I described it, a vote. In the neutral voting block, everyone can vote from a scale of 0 to 255. So if you wanted to vote yes to everything, then you go with 255. The reason for this is that it allows parties like the Pirate Party that might be 73% in favour to actually vote 73% in favour. And so if people choose, they can vote 50-50, which isn't exactly the same as an abstention. They can do that as well, but they can vote in whatever proportions they want. And then finally, the last argument here is just the name of the resolution, which in this case is T-009. So the future potential for the sorts of things that we can do is the first is, and a lot of people will immediately criticize electronic voting for not having secret ballot. Now, I'm not convinced that secret ballot is actually needed in an electronic voting system, but some people like it. And so we can use, so for those of you who have heard of CoinJoin, or haven't heard of CoinJoin, it's a protocol that's been suggested to use standard Bitcoin transactions, but obfuscate the sender. And so the idea is that 8 people who want to make a transaction can get together and mix all their transactions up so it has 8 inputs and 8 outputs, but it's done in such a way that if for an outside observer later on, they cannot tell which input went to which output. And so it's a form of weak anonymity, which is why there's identity transfer and voting via CoinJoin. So that if you wanted, you could transfer your identity through several CoinJoin transactions, and by the end of that, it's so mixed up that no one can identify with any certainty who you are. So secret ballot can still be maintained without using crazy homomorphic encryption or all this sort of other stuff. We can still do it with standard Bitcoin stuff. Now, at the moment, unfortunately, it's currently non-standard because the standard transaction rules say that you can only have one op return output per transaction, whereas in this case, we'd need 10 or 20 or whatever else, depending on the number of people participating. So it's currently not standard. That doesn't mean it can't get into the Bitcoin blockchain. There are still a few miners, or I think it's just Eligius, that will include non-standard transactions. I've successfully tested that, but it takes like 8 hours to get a confirmation. So at this stage, it's not production ready. So routing for issues. The way that I see this sort of thing going on is that there is the naive idea of just putting categories on things, but then you've got a whole lot of problems about who decides what category things are in, what if an economic category is miscategorized as environmental. We don't want the Greens deciding on our economic policy when we've delegated someone else, particularly because we want them to do our economic side. And so the issue of dividing issues up into different categories is a complex one. I think that one of the best ways that this could be managed is via a routing system, similar to the way that IP addresses are routed, which basically says that the start of the number corresponds to a geographic location, which in this case means a policy location, so environmental or economic or whatever else. There is an issue in that you can only categorize things in one, it needs to be in one category. You can introduce multiple categories by going multi-dimensional, but then that introduces a lot of issues about how do you actually decide where things go. You can say, okay, so everyone votes on it, but then you have more complexity. And so this is an unsolved problem. At least it's not solved elegantly, but in the future, I think we can solve it.
Could you just explain the why behind that? Why is there a potential for routing of issues? Is it more like a Dewey Decimal System for categorizing votes?
Sort of. The issue is that you can have I can suggest a policy that is a little bit environmental and a little bit animal rights and a little bit economics, right? In a Dewey Decimal System, everything's on one linear scale, right? So and IP addresses are likewise on one linear scale. And it makes it difficult because if you just average the position of environmental, animal, and economics, you might end up with, like socio something or other, and it'll just be totally different. And so to then introduce that, you then need a multi-dimensional system, but then there's the question of how many degrees of freedom does legislation have? And so, I would guess maybe 7 would be enough, but that's crazy many. Like, that's going to be 7 bytes, and like a lot of voting and a lot of information that needs to go into actually determining that route. And so that I don't think we don't have a good solution because we don't have a good understanding of how to organize policy yet to make sure that every similar policy or similar policies are grouped together. We can do that on a linear scale, but then we have the caveat that I mentioned before. We can do that in the multidimensional scale, but then we need a lot more information and a lot more processing to go into deciding where things actually go. And so I'm sure there's an elegant solution out there, but I don't know what it is yet. So that's an unsolved problem for the moment.
And then even communicating that back to people as humans to understand it.
The way that I've thought about it is to have an algorithm that basically asks, is this similar to this policy, or is it dissimilar to this policy, and so on, and go through maybe like 50 policies in a similar way to 20 questions, essentially, and to narrow down where it is by continually asking more and more questions. And that way you can abstract it out and end up with a very numerical answer as opposed to a very human answer. That's one way of dealing with it, but again. Cool. And so then there's also the idea of partial delegation via routes. That if we have this, that we can say, in the economics area, I want all the social economics to go to this guy, but I want all the industrial economics to go to this guy. I want environmental, broadly speaking, including, animals and everything else to go to, this person over here, and then whatever else. And so that's another area that needs to be, that I think people would very much like, but at the moment, isn't easy to do because we don't have a good categorization system on which to base it. And so that means that partial delegation via routes is not something that we can handle particularly easily yet. There is an option of just splitting in a different way, that being that 50% of my vote goes here and 50% goes there, to do different people, irrespective of issue, but that again has caveats that I'm sure you can all think of. So these are some of the potential ideas in the future to really extend the system, and this I would say is something to worry about maybe a decade in the future, or when we reach critical mass or that sort of thing, and we actually need to go beyond it, and when more people are going to be thinking about these issues. So, conclusions and criticisms for the project as a whole. So the general strategy, which I put this in conclusions because I didn't have anywhere else to put it, the general strategy is, there's two types of strategy really in the early stages. There's local council and federal/state upper houses, which use the more promising or more fertile election system, that being group voting tickets. So, that economic, by the way, the economic thing I was putting forward before about parties interacting, I call that the Senate Preference Hack, because it undermines the system of which we were meant to do it before, but in sort of a benevolent way. In that it doesn't work if you're evil, no one's going to preference you, but if you're, if you can outcompete regular democracy, then people will readily preference you. So use the Senate Preference Act with other parties for extra preferences. That's at the federal and state level. Not all state legislative councils have group voting tickets, so there's like 4, I think, that are receptive. Victoria is one, New South Wales is not. We can also use independents for federal and state if the party's not registered, but again, integrity is required of the candidate. We can't bind their behaviour. There are various legal reasons for that, but basically the candidate needs to be honest. There is, the counterpoint is that as soon as they're not honest, they're not going to be elected again. So it's sort of a trade-off on that regard. So I'm not totally satisfied with that solution, but it's not the worst case. And then in terms of local elections, the pluses, they're usually easy to win. At least, the local electorate that I'm in had 13 candidates for 12 seats at the last election. So that's, you literally need to sneeze to win the seat. You can run this independent if needed. Again, integrity are required. The good thing about local elections as well is this idea of if we get small communities that come together and actually, in only perhaps a small number of local electorates, can build up a community that's ready to participate at a greater level. And so if the federal and state stuff doesn't work out, then there's still local, like grassroots style as a backup, which, isn't ideal, but is a slow, ongoing process that may yield good results still. What's it all mean in the scheme of things? And this is particularly to do with the federal Senate elections. This slide was intended for the next federal election, though I'm not sure if that's going to happen. at least being able to run a candidate. So with the right incentive structure and with goodish participation from other micro parties, as it stands, we don't need full participation. Depending on the parameters you use for a simulation, we can sometimes get incredibly good results. There's one simulation that I did that had with 0.5% of the primary vote had a 100% chance of electing a candidate in New South Wales, and it wasn't even an unrealistic one as well. We can go through that at the end if anyone wants to ask about that. But with goodish participation from micro parties and maybe 1% of the primary vote, this is again the Senate preference hack coming back with the 1% thing here. Then we can turn the balance of power from this, which is actually taken from Wikipedia currently, into this. And that gradation there is really meant to show the potential that I see for the representation and discussion of interests within the neutral voting bloc if we can actually get a seat. So I think that's the thing to focus on. If we can do that, then I'd be very happy. So the criticisms and risks. So, minor parties may reject or shun the neutral voting bloc, and if they do that, of course, the Senate Preference Act doesn't work, and all of this goes down the tube. The micro parties that I've talked to a few micro parties so far, and they seem pretty skeptical. That might be because the idea is really complex. It might be because they see this invading on the idea of their sovereignty, as in they wouldn't actually get a seat. They would get say, but they wouldn't get a seat, and of course, a seat is $200,000 a year and plenty of exposure, and so that's a lot to miss out on. But if micro parties are skeptical, and if they don't get the trade mechanics, if they don't get why this is beneficial to them, then it's not going to happen. That, I think, is the biggest risk, is that just micro parties don't want to participate. Another risk, so I didn't cover this much in this slide deck, but the idea of binding senators' votes in the Senate contractually is probably non-legal. That goes back to a whole lot of precedents, the earliest one from the 1890s, which involved contractually obligating a senator to step down after their term. The courts basically take it a priori that if you contractually bind a senator, then it is not in the public interest, therefore they will not enforce any contract with the senator. So in this case, it's a bit ironic because the neutral voting bloc, in my opinion, is in the public interest and that it would help to bind senators' behaviour, but that's an obstacle we'll have to work around. And then the final criticism that comes up a lot is the idea of users' computers just not being secure. And this, I think, is fair, but I think it's reasonably addressed through a model of central authority where you can revoke identities very easily. We don't have the same issue with revoking identities in this system as we do with, say, revoking certificates on the internet, which are another form of cryptographic identity. And so revocations are going to be easy. We can easily, as soon as there's funny business, just wipe away someone's identity. And once they prove it again through an AML-style proof, we can then allocate their votes back to a new identity. And so that's very quickly and easily recoverable from, so I don't see that as a major criticism. As a status update, so website's created, the minimum viable product is done. The protocol's under development. I've done a Python proof of concept, which includes the vote tallier, the voting system, all that sort of stuff. I'm writing a Haskell implementation, which for any programmers out there, you'll know that Haskell is a purely functional language and tends to, once you get it to compile, doesn't have bugs. And so I'm very much looking forward to that. That'll provide a lot more security in terms of letting people be confident the software doesn't have bugs, that it's not going to end up with a fork, that we're not going to get a split of consensus. At the moment, this 41 is a little bit out of date. We're currently at 43, which is why I didn't update it. A bit demoralizing, but this is in the last 20 days, of course, as well. We're about 7% of the way there. I think that if we don't reach if we can't run as a party for the next election, then I might try running as an independent. But we'll see about that when it gets there. And if that fails, then there's also the local council / state avenues to try and get in that way. But this election is the coalition have said that they want to run it to take out the full 15 months. Obviously, there's been murmurings that for a November election, so depending on how that goes will depend on whether we actually get up and running before the next election. But that's the rough status update. So, before the questions, I have to say that any Australians out there who think this is a good idea and maybe might improve things, I would really encourage you to go to that URL and join. I was going to bring a tablet along, but this morning I forgot, and so it's sitting in my room somewhere. But I will happily provide a computer for anyone who is lacking one at the moment if they would like to sign up. It's a short Google form with 6 questions, which is mostly address and that sort of stuff. But yeah, anyway, so questions.
Yeah, any sort of voting system
there are smaller things at stake in, let's say, associations and clubs and so on, which are all sorts of many societies, many democratic institutions. Why not try and run it on a small scale first? I don't know if you are in the society of astronomers or.
Well, I mean, we know that liquid democracy works. We know that it can be used for a good decision-making process. The Pirate Party has definitely proven that, I think. I guess the issue with why would you run it in a club is, often because of the constitution, you end up with a board of directors anyway. And with if you're taking, even if you were including, say, all 200 members that you had, 200 members is still enough to do a direct democracy if you want. You could do something like this, but it's very low yield for what is currently a lot of effort to set it up and to maintain it. And so I feel like for a big federal thing or even like local parliament, then it would be worthwhile. But at the moment, I'm not that interested in trying to pursue and get other little organisations involved because they don't have the sorts of scaling issues that democracy that we live in has. And so I mean, it's totally possible. We can totally do it for a small organisation.
One type of association would be a party internally, which is what was with the other system, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's what the Pirate Party does. The other thing about small organisations like that is they don't need trustless voting. That's usually they trust each other enough. It's like the Pirate Party. All their voting is run off one server. Obviously, they're not concerned about the admin manipulating the vote. And so this is it is a more expensive platform. It's a harder platform to use, but the payoff is the trustlessness, and that's why the blockchain needs to be used, and why there are more appropriate things for small parties. But ultimately, liquid democracy could be used in that sort of thing without issue.
Cool. Any more questions?
Could you talk a little bit about the alignment back with the typical voting terms? Because obviously this gives you real-time feedback. How does that then align back to the worthiness of a 3-year term versus what this is essentially making much more rapid and transparent? Like when you come to the end of 3 years, does it matter that you have different people in there?
Well, ideally, it shouldn't. Ideally, the candidates who are elected shouldn't matter at all. If they do matter, that's breaking the system because it's essentially compromising the results that come off the blockchain. And so, ideally, this should operate transparently over the existing system. And besides needing to get candidates elected, the normal election cycle shouldn't play much of a process or much of a role in actually deciding the internal reorganisations within the neutral voting bloc. Any other questions? We all done?
Great. Okay. Well, thanks, Max, for that. I'm sure many people will be interested in sort of seeing the progress of your party. I think it's a really interesting application of the blockchain, and hopefully we'll see some more progress around this. Thank you again to, Sam's just fully left, but thanks to Bitcoin Group for sponsoring pizzas. Thank you for hosting us, Melbourne Bitcoin Technology Centre. It's always a mouthful for me. And again, we'll be having actually something in the next few weeks. We've got an international guest that we might be able to Skype in, working on it now. So we'll keep everyone on the Bitcoin Melbourne list informed. But if we sort of tie everything up, it's going to be a really interesting one. And yeah, I'll let everyone know though. So thanks again, Max, for coming down all the way from Sydney and presenting that to us. Really interesting stuff. Thank you.